Are we ready?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our session, Spotlight on Decriminalization, Disability, Special Education, and Juvenile Justice. My name is Denise Lugo Fowler. I'm the Director of Training and Outreach for Disability Rights New Jersey, and I'm thrilled to be the host for this session. I will be monitoring the chat and supporting our speakers today. And just a couple of quick housekeeping items. If everyone can mute their microphones during this session, that would be great. This way there are less distractions. And if you have any questions, you can put them into the chat box and we will take them. I will ask the presenters actually if they want to take them during the session or at the end. We will make that known. Also, there is captions available for anyone who needs that. The boxes are across the bottom of the Zoom menu. You can click on CC live transcript and the captions will be available for you. Also, the sessions are being recorded, so they will be available to everyone after the conference is over. And that is all my housekeeping. So I just would like to introduce our two speakers today. Regina Ann Smith, who is a staff attorney for Disability Rights New Jersey, and Ruby Kish, who is a Skadden Fellow from the Education Law Center. Welcome.
Thank you very much. We're so happy to be here and happy to be with everyone. It's called a roundtable for a reason. So we are going to provide you with some information today and some resources, but we do want to hear from you and make sure that this is an active brainstorm. So I think we'll begin before Ruby kicks us off with a poll, and that just really will help us to identify and understand who's here with us today and how we can best direct this presentation. So I will launch a poll now, and you'll see 3 questions. The first is, what best describes you? The second says, are you working with youth currently who are court involved? And the third is, have you ever worked with youth who are disciplined in school for behavior that could be related to disabilities? So if you want to answer those 3 questions while Ruby, my amazing esteemed colleague from the Education Law Center up in Newark, while she gets her presentation up and shares her screen, you can answer those questions now. And I'm thrilled that she's here to help us with this presentation today.
Thank you, Regina, for that introduction. I'm pulling up my PowerPoint right now.
All right, I think, my camera screen is just a little bit slow. But Ruby, it looks like we have about 60% of our people work currently right now with youth who are court involved. Yeah. We have some child study team members, a parent on the call. We have some advocates and attorneys, and then even a speech and language pathologist. We're so glad that you're here. And yes, please put in the chat if you have a special connection to this population. But Ruby, I think most importantly, over 75% of our participants today have worked with youth who have been disciplined in school for things that could be related to their disability. So that's really great to know. I'm going to end this poll. And I turn it over to you for an awesome introduction into this world of the school to prison pipeline, school discipline, and our court involved youth.
Great, thank you, Regina. So as Regina mentioned, what I do for the Education Law Center, what my fellowship project is based on, is providing advocacy, education advocacy to youth that are involved in the justice system. I work with youth in Essex County, New Jersey, so that includes Newark, which is obviously the biggest city in New Jersey. And so what I want to talk about, just a brief overview, is I'm going to talk a little bit about the link between education and the justice system. And I'm going to do this by looking at some of the data in Newark schools. And then I'm going to discuss how educational advocacy can help justice-involved youth to really help them avoid that school-to-prison pipeline that I'll be talking about. And then finally, I'm going to look at the red flags that we look for as advocates that might indicate that a youth could become at risk of being justice-involved. So the youth that I work with are already in the justice system, but for many of you, who just work with youth who are in school but have been disciplined. We want to prevent that school to prison pipeline. So it's important to look for these red flags. So I'm going to focus on two aspects of the school to prison pipeline. Often we know about it through school resource officers and police in schools, and how that can lead to young people being arrested and eventually involved in the justice system. However, there are many ways that the school to prison pipeline works, and I'm going to focus on these two, which is academic failure and exclusionary discipline. So academic failure is exactly what it sounds like. It's just when a young person in school struggles to keep up academically, and because of that, they end up just kind of distancing themselves from the school, and all of that through a cascading series of events can increase the chances that they become justice involved. And exclusionary discipline is something that you all are very familiar with, and I know this because the poll has indicated that many of you have worked with students who've been disciplined in schools. And that's when students are expelled or suspended more often, or any other way excluded from school because of behaviors. And these two aspects of our education system impact students of color and students with disability. In my talk, I am going to focus on students with disabilities because that's really the students that I help the most. And honestly, because I work in Essex County and with the Essex County Public Defenders, most of those students anyway are students of color. So there's a great deal of overlap in those populations, at least with the clients that I work with. But moving forward, I'm going to show data on students with disabilities just to show how they are so vulnerable to these two pressures that can lead to justice involvement. So in terms of, I wanted to kind of do this flow chart to show you how these two pressures lead to justice involvement. So academic failure is, for students with disabilities specifically, is when students are not identified as having a disability, or if they're identified, they don't receive the appropriate services to address it. And then exclusionary discipline, as I just mentioned, is when they're suspended or expelled, and often this is for behaviors that are a manifestation of their disability. So both of these lead to students become having a sense of helplessness and hopelessness as their ability to be a student. And that negatively impacts them, so they detach socially and emotionally from teachers and peers. And all of this leads them to skip school, engage in disruptive behaviors that lead to more suspensions, and this increases the likelihood that they'll drop out. And again, all of these negative pressures increase the chances that they will become justice involved. So in terms of academic failure, I like this quote because it really kind of describes the pressure that students feel when they are failing at school or when they're reading well below grade level. And they know this. Students are very intuitive that they know when they're not competing compared to their peers. And this is a quote about why students drop out. And it's because some kind of academic challenge that undermines their faith in themselves as learners, that then led to helplessness and hopelessness about their ability to be a student. So you can imagine a young person feeling this pressure is much more likely to distance themselves from school or drop out. And so why are students with disabilities vulnerable to academic challenges? Again, it's because they are not identified. Often we find students have never been evaluated. So they're not identified as having a disability. So they never receive appropriate special education supports. And then the students that I work with that have been identified, very often their supports and accommodations they receive are just inadequate or ineffective. So many of the high school students I work with who've had IEPs since elementary school are still reading at elementary school levels. And that's just because they have not received the appropriate academic support. And so I want to look at this academic failure through the lens of graduation. Graduation is, if a student can make it all the way through high school and graduate, then they are not experiencing any academic challenges. So I wanted to compare graduation rates of students with and without disabilities across the United States, and then in New Jersey and in Newark. You could see that there is a discrepancy. For students with disabilities, they struggle much more to meet those graduation requirements and graduate from high school. It looks as if New Jersey is doing better than the national average in terms of graduation. And honestly, this has some part to do with our graduation requirements here in New Jersey. But then if you look at Newark, across the board, graduation is lower, both for students with and without disability. And that's because in a lot of our schools in Newark, and I'll show you that data coming up, that the students are just not receiving the supports they need to be able to graduate. So here is some of that data. It's the graduation rates of students with disabilities, and I'm looking at 3 categories of schools in Newark. The comprehensive schools are really just the neighborhood schools, the schools that most students will attend. The magnet schools are the ones that you have to apply, and they're much more restrictive in who is going to be able to attend those schools. And the charter schools are charter schools. We all know what charter schools are like, so I don't need to describe those. But I do want to look at the graduation rates of these various schools. So the numbers are the graduation rates of students with disabilities. So you could see immediately that the numbers are much lower for the comprehensive schools, and some of them are extremely low, like Westside High School. For this year that the data was collected in 2019, only 36% of students with disabilities graduated. And so you can just imagine what happens to the remaining students that didn't graduate that year, and what their options were, not having graduated from high school and having a disability. And you see, of course, the magnet schools are much higher in terms of their graduation rates, and the charter schools are too. And I want to just take a minute to talk about why charter school graduation rates are higher. And it's because they tend to push out students that are not academically successful or have behavioral challenges. And because they do that, they tend to only keep in the students with disabilities who are much more likely to graduate from school. So it's important to note that 90% of students with disabilities are capable of graduating. So those numbers are not just because, well, of course, we should expect that students with disabilities wouldn't graduate. They can if they receive the support that they need. And so the lower numbers are really indicative of the lack of support that many of these students have been receiving. Sorry, guys, 1 minute. Okay, so this number is always really shocking to me, but the more I work with this population of youth, the more that it does not surprise me, which is 85% of youth in juvenile detention have some type of disability, but only 37% receive any special education. So it really tells you that the reason these students struggle so much, and one of the reasons that it's much easier for them to become justice involved, is because they are not receiving the special education services that they need. And so now I just want to pivot to talk about exclusionary discipline and justice involvement. And some of these statistics are really informative as to understanding how the relationship really between exclusionary discipline and justice involvement, which is that 61% of students in juvenile facilities report having been suspended or expelled from school at least once. Suspensions triple a student's chances of becoming involved in the juvenile justice system. And suspended youth don't begin to engage in more serious delinquency until after their first suspension. So we do see that the young people who have been involved in the justice system are much more likely to have been suspended from school at some point. And so again, if we look at the suspension rates of students with disabilities in the United States and New Jersey, and then in Newark, we can see that students with disabilities are much more likely to be suspended from school, really across the board. And it makes sense. Students with disabilities tend to have more behavioral issues. And so the reason they're suspended is because the schools are not adequately addressing those behavioral issues through the IEP process, but rather they're pushing the students out. And so if we look at the suspension of students with disabilities in those 3 categories of schools that I looked at before, we could see the suspension rates are much higher for actually both the comprehensive schools and the charter schools compared to the magnet schools. And as a point of reference, I don't have this here on the chart, but in New Jersey, the average suspension rate hovers between 3 and 5%. So it's at this lowest line here. So if you look at that, you can see how much higher the suspension rate is for some of these schools in Newark. And really, we don't see such a huge discrepancy. Well, in some of the schools we do, but we don't see a great big discrepancy between students with disabilities and students without in some of the schools, in the comprehensive schools at least. And that's just because suspension is so high across the board, I think. In the charter schools, you do see those discrepancies. And again, that's because the charter schools, if a student is not successful in a charter school, they always have the option to go back to their home district, to their neighborhood school. And so by suspending them, it makes it more likely that they'll just leave school and end up attending one of these comprehensive schools instead. So the charter schools, in a way, incentivized to keep those graduation rates up by suspending the students that are just not meeting their academic or behavioral requirements. So again, why are students suspended? Because it's just much easier to punish or suspend a student than take the time and effort to come up with an adequate plan of support. But what's important to note is the IEP process requires the time and effort to come up with an adequate plan of support. It's just that there's no one advocating for these students. So they don't understand, and their parents don't understand that, the school can't continuously suspend them for behaviors related to their disability without taking a close look at the IEP to see what other services might assist them. And I wanted to talk briefly about COVID and how it impacted the demographic of students and the community of students that I've been working with. And again, this is looking at some of the same schools, not the charter schools, but the magnet and comprehensive schools. And here, this is actually graphing chronic absenteeism from last September, so a year ago, during remote learning. And you could see, if you guys have noticed, that there's some of the same, maybe 5 schools that have the lowest suspension rate, highest suspension rate, lowest graduation rate, and also highest chronic absenteeism rate. So there's a lot of negative pressures on these schools or on the students attending these schools that will make it much easier for them to become justice involved and harder for them to graduate and become graduates of the high school and move on to career in college. And so I've talked to many, many students who had gone through the remote learning period when I started my fellowship back in January. And the majority of them were not consistently logging on. Some of them lacked motivation, and others, they could not learn through that online system. So all of the negative pressures that I had talked about on students with disabilities, specifically in Newark, are likely to be exacerbated this year because students are coming off of a year and a half where they have received very little instruction. And also socially, they have not had the opportunity to work on the skills that they need to improve those behavioral relationships that they need to establish with peers and teachers. So the suspension is likely to be higher this year, and the graduation rates are likely to be lower unless Newark schools and other schools have a really comprehensive plan to address these young people coming back to school. Okay, so now I want to talk about some of the data that I've collected. So again, my fellowship requires me to provide educational advocacy to justice-involved youth. Originally, the plan was to be in the courthouse where the families go and wait until the judge calls upon them and they appear before the judge. I interned at the public defender's office when I was in law school, so I was very familiar with the juvenile justice system and how it worked, and thought that a project like this could kind of weave itself seamlessly into the court proceedings and what was already happening in the courthouse. But of course, COVID shut everything down, and at least in Essex County, everything is conducted via phone. There's some return to in-person hearings, but it's very little. And so I couldn't be in the courthouse. And so originally the plan was just to get referrals from the public defenders and the CMOs that provide mental health counseling to these young people. But I realized quickly that the public defenders and CMOs were not seeing the same red flags that I would have identified because they just don't ask those questions. They don't need to ask the types of questions that I would ask for their work. And so I moved to a system where I was able to get a list of all of the young people appearing before either of the juvenile court justices, and was able to reach out to the families directly. And so each day I have the list, and I don't have the best contact information for all of the families, but for those that I do, I will call and ask a series of 7 questions. The questions not only have helped me to determine who I can advocate for, who is in need of advocacy, but it's really allowed me to create this data collection project that I don't think has been done in New Jersey and rarely done across the United States, except for some pockets here and there, which is to really understand the educational challenges faced by juveniles who are entering the justice system. I shared some of that data with you about students who were suspended and then involved in the justice system, or students who didn't receive services and were involved in the justice system. But we wanted to see really what it was like here in Essex County in New Jersey. And I think this data helps us fill in the gaps of our understanding of the school to prison pipeline, since again, the data is not really being collected, except maybe for young people who are in state facilities. So the first thing I wanted to ask, or one of the first things I asked, was, has your child ever been suspended from school? And sure enough, 75% of the young people or their parents that I talked to had been suspended at least once. These results are a little bit outdated, because I talked to 71 justice-involved youth, and now I'm almost at a little past 80, but the number hasn't changed. I just checked it this morning. It's about 78, so it's gone up a little bit. But again, it's not surprising given the data. I shared some of that with you all before. We know that these young people are more likely to have been suspended. What this number doesn't capture is the majority of the youth that I did speak to have been suspended multiple times. Some of them were giving me numbers like 20 to 30. And also this 25%, a majority of the 25% are younger kids, which we have very few of in the justice system, but we do have. But they are the 8th graders and the 7th graders, and the 9th graders are less likely to have been suspended. By the time you're a 12th grader, having attended one of the schools that I showed you data for, you are very likely to have been suspended at least once if you are also involved in the justice system. So I think the data is really interesting and definitely requires us to look further at what schools are suspending students the most, which we have data for, and try and align that with the youth that are involved in the justice system to see if we really do have a situation where some schools are almost feeding the justice system and feeding that pipeline. So the next thing I wanted to ask is, what types of academic challenges have youth experienced? So we know that that students in the justice system tend to have disabilities, but I wanted to ask beyond that, have they struggled academically and have they had challenges academically? And 62% reported that they did. This number was a little difficult to get at because a lot of parents don't want to admit that their child is struggling in school. So I would ask questions like what types of grades they got, have they ever been retained? Are they reading or writing at grade level? And again, the majority of families said that their child had struggled in school. I'm so sorry, guys. I think I had messed up a little bit of my statistics. So that this number is the percent of students with a suspected disability, not suspended. The numbers are very similar, so it's not a big change in the data, but 75% had a disability or a suspected disability, and 78%, so that number didn't change, have been suspended from school. So I'm just going to back up and go back to the 75%. This is students who've had a disability or a suspected disability. And so again, these numbers are not surprising. We know from all of the data on the school to prison pipeline that students with disabilities are much more likely to become involved in the justice system. So the fact that 75% of the students that I interviewed have had a disability and the suspected disability is really based on my interview. Would I recommend that the child be evaluated? If I were representing them, would I write a letter to the school outlining why they needed an evaluation? Many of them hadn't received an evaluation. So again, 75% have had a disability or suspected disability, and 78%, so that number hasn't changed too much, have been suspended. So taken together, the data suggests that both of these pressures that I discussed earlier, the academic challenges and the exclusionary discipline, are certainly impacting the youth that I work with in Essex County, New Jersey. So those two issues are issues that we really need to address when we're working with students, even who are not in justice involved, to look to see whether or not they're experiencing either one of those two issues. So I want to talk about why. Why do we see these challenges? Why are students facing these issues? And I wanted to, again, break it up between academic challenges and exclusionary discipline. So the gaps for students facing academic challenges are that often they have outdated evaluations that fail to address the needs of students. There's a failure to conduct evaluations that are required to understand the student's disability. So sometimes, you know, a student needs a specific evaluation to really understand what's going on, and the school doesn't do those evaluations. The goals that are set are not meaningful and measurable. So, you know, they're not holding the child to the standard that is necessary for them to make academic progress. Students are pushed along year after year without making progress. This is why I have so many clients who are reading at elementary school levels while they're in high school. The programs and supports are not tailored to the individual student. So sometimes, especially students with learning disabilities, require specific reading programs that are not offered by the schools. Inappropriate placement, students might require special education classes or even out of district placements in order to make progress, and they're not offered those. And then, of course, the failure to identify students with disabilities. So students who are just retained or just pushed along without actually getting the evaluations that they need. And then gaps in the system for exclusionary discipline is essentially the use of suspension instead of behavioral supports, or failure to conduct a functional behavioral assessment to determine exactly how the student's behavior interferes with learning. Doing a functional behavioral assessment is how we create the appropriate behavior intervention plans to address behaviors. And I have not yet had a client who'd had a functional behavioral assessment completed, which is essential if a student is having those types of behaviors that interfere with learning. And students with behavioral disabilities are often denied evaluations, and they're instead just pushed along and suspended and expelled and pushed to alternative schools rather than being evaluated. And then it's really important to note that schools that have these school-wide positive behavior intervention plans, restorative justice, and social emotional learning, where they have a school-wide program, it benefits all students, but it especially benefits students with disabilities. So these school-wide plans, in addition to the individualized plans, are really kind of the gold star of how we help students with disabilities who have behavioral issues. And so what are the red flags that I look for when I'm talking to families? And for you all as well, when you are talking to students and families, it's really failing grades. If a student is failing school, there's something going on with that student that needs to be looked at further. Students who are previously retained, I didn't put that statistic up, but I do have a large percentage of students who have been retained. And usually this is done before they're evaluated. They're retained as kind of a solution to a problem, but rarely does retention work when a student has a disability and needs services, or never, should I say, does retention work for a student with disabilities. It rarely works for any student, I should say. Students reading and writing well below grade level. This is often hard for parents to determine just by asking them, but they're always aware if their child is at an elementary school level when they're in high school. I suspect that many of the parents who don't know, if tested, their student might still be 1 or 2 grade levels below. But many would tell me right off the bat that yes, their child cannot read effectively. I had one student who the IEP said they were reading at a kindergarten level and they were in 9th grade. So some of this is really outrageous that students could be pushed along that far into high school without getting the appropriate reading instruction. A significant history of suspensions and expulsions or detentions, that definitely could be a sign of a behavioral disability or something else that needs to be addressed by the school. Truancy is a red flag. Truancy could be a family-based problem, but it also could be a special education-based problem. If the child is avoiding school, there could be something related to anxiety or behaviors causing that truancy. And then transfers to alternative programs, like I had mentioned before. Sometimes students with behavioral disabilities, instead of being evaluated, they are pushed off to alternative programs without receiving the appropriate behavioral interventions and supports. So that essentially sums up my presentation. I'm definitely available to answer questions, but I know that Regina was going to talk a little bit more about her clients and some of the services that she offers. And experiences that she's had representing the same population of students. So I am going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Regina.
Thank you. So if you have any questions or you want to know more information, I know, Ruby, someone asked if your slides will be available. Can you send me a PDF copy of that if you don't mind sharing that data?
Yes.
I think it's very valuable.
Absolutely.
So it's nice to have an overview and to have data on how we end up with this school to prison pipeline that is more like a superhighway than just a one-way street. Right. So sometimes we imagine the school to prison pipeline as you did something in school that landed you in a court involved situation, and then you further your career in the criminal justice system. When in fact, we see a lot of youth returning back to the community, coming back, and they have terms of probation that might include something that has to do with going to school with 0 unexcused absences or tardies. They have essays that they need to write. They have letters of apology. And if they don't fulfill their obligations in probation, they could be violated and then go back to detention centers or detention alternatives and possibly even removed from their home. So it doesn't even have to be that, you know, you're starting on the path to a lifetime of criminal activity. It could be that you were adjudicated for one charge, and that one charge follows you from point A to point B to point C and keeps going. So when we're looking at some of the youth that we're all working with, or that we have in our life, or that we've known in the past, one of the things that we want to do is say, okay, what can we do? How can we help them then in this system that seems to not be adequately prepared to present them with the services and supports they need? And so a first resource is they can call on educational advocates like Ruby and myself. So Ruby is in Essex County up in North Jersey, and my project at Disability Rights New Jersey is down in Mercer County, which is our Trenton School District area. But there are a lot of places that will offer educational advocacy or even just support for you. So if you today are thinking about who in your area or neighborhood might you be able to contact for some additional supports or services, please feel free to reach out to Ruby and I, and we can help connect you with some of those people if you're not particularly in our area. But through this project, we have been able to work with numerous youth, not only on their court involved side, but also on the education side. And so what I'd like to do now with you for a few minutes is engage in a little hypothetical. We want to introduce you to one of our clients. So I hope you're ready. You can participate with your microphone off, or you can put things in the chat, but I'm going to share my screen and we will focus on a client. My computer is working really slow today. So on your screen right now, you'll see some of our most prevalent educational disabilities within the juvenile justice system. So I'd like to start here because I think it frames for us what type of client we're about to meet. Specific learning disabilities are really an example of that, a disability that is prevalent within our system. A specific learning disability, as most of you know on this call, can include things like reading and writing. It can include where you fall academically below grade level. It's a kind of a catch-all for a lot of academic disabilities. It impacts everything about the way that you work with people, how you think, how you respond, how you read. We also see many of our youth, if they are diagnosed with emotional and behavioral disabilities, so things like conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, and sometimes just other health impairments like ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, PTSD, we might see anxiety, depression, or even more prevalent fetal alcohol syndrome that goes undiagnosed often, especially when students get to middle school and high school, you start to see greater signs of fetal alcohol syndrome. We've also had youth with autism. And more importantly, as Ruby mentioned, a lot of young people who haven't been diagnosed or even been evaluated for a diagnosis. So with those kind of disabilities in mind, we're going to first take a deep breath and say, how are we going to handle all of this? Well, we're going to look deeper. We're going to slow down. So these are two steps that I like to recommend to anyone working with these youth. You know, we really want to look at the common traits of hidden disabilities. Those are the ones that aren't totally visible to your eye. might include seeing people who pretend to understand something when they don't. They have a strong desire to manipulate or just please the authority figure that's in front of them at that moment. They'll say the right things, even if they have no intention of understanding the tools that it will take to follow through. They might want to hide their disability from other people. There might be a sense that it's not a badge of honor to have a disability, but more like something they have to cover up. We see youth who are sensitive to touches and sounds and lights. What other types of traits do you recognize in a person with possibly a hidden disability or an educational disability like the ones we've mentioned? What are some other ones? If you want to put them in the chat, that would be great. You can say it out loud. Oh, awesome. Poor eye gaze, right. Sensitive to touches, sounds, lights. Maybe they're not able to meet your eye gaze. Definitely signs of PTSD, things that might cause you to be anxious or nervous, situations that you refuse to put yourself in again, a definite trauma history. And trauma history looks different for everyone, right? So some of the things that you might recognize in trauma history will be different from youth to youth, but it's important to have that umbrella over top. Avoidance to talk, avoidance to speak in meetings, or when you're called on in class, or even when you're in court in front of the judge. And that can also indicate some poor communication skills. There might be a lack of impulse control. I know that everyone has a lack of impulse control on different days, and some people it's harder for others to control their impulse to maybe say something explosive or to get frustrated easily. We might see people who are vulnerable to peer pressure and poor judgment. And when you ask them, why did you do what you did? The response can sometimes be, I don't know. And that's not really helpful when you're trying to get to the root of the problem. So when you're looking at all of these traits, it's important to think, is disability playing a role? And then when you start to uncover some of that, you really want to look and say, okay, what am I actually seeing in front of me? How is that behavior making me feel? And what can I do about it, or what do I need to understand before I respond? And I think if we can start to advocate for individuals to really take a pause before responding, we will see less instances of school resource officers, of police being called, of quick, impulsive decisions to de-escalate the crisis without thinking through the ramifications of it. So that's what we're trying to really get people to acknowledge, is that sometimes it's important to take a pause when it's safe and it's available in order to fully address the situation appropriately. Slide 7. Okay. Can you, I don't know if you can, what can you see on your screen, Michael?
Where can we start? Look deeper.
Okay. I can't get to my, sorry, everyone. Okay, so let's look at a case scenario. So this is a fake client, really a conglomeration of a lot of different clients that I've had throughout this past year. And so we're going to look first at his incident. Miles decides to bring a knife to school and says it's for protection. On his way to school, officers see him. He looks really nervous, he's fidgety. He makes some eye contact with them and does the ever popular, oh no, and then runs the other direction. The officers chase him and they apprehend him, but while they're apprehending him, Miles reacts. So he starts kicking the officers. He ends up being tackled by the officers, and then a knife is found in the bushes where this incident took place. What jumps out to you about his arrest, if you want to put it in the chat? And Michael, if you can help just kind of read out the chat. I have lost the ability to see anything, so.
No yeah, problem. And I could read them too if you need me to.
Okay. So what jumps out to you? What is the first thing that you see on that list? Ruby had mentioned red flags. What is that for you that you've noticed in this that you would trigger you to engage in some alternative response?
So Marie put in the chat, the first thing that jumped out to her was the fact that he's afraid that he needs protection in school.
Wow, yep.
And then Maria added that the police seem to have apprehended him without cause.
Great.
Laisha added in the chat, same question. Why does he need protection? Why does he feel unsafe? She also went on to say that the reaction to being approached or stopped by the police was to kick them and to react to some violence. Tabitha says that he's hyper vigilant, right? He's fidgety, he's nervous. I think she's probably picking up on something. That's what I would have said if I had the chance to write this in a chat. So I'll say it. Is the fact that he's nervous and fidgety, he's scared on his way to school. And that his first reaction when he sees a police officer and makes the eye contact is, uh-oh, and takes off.
Right. So it's a little bit of, executive functioning, things going on there. We see reactions, nervousness, fidgety, and then as everyone pointed out, the protection immediately stuck out to all of you. Now, if we take this for what it is, right, there are situations where an incident like this can be looked at by police, sent to the prosecutor, and then immediately stocketed for adjudication. That means that it's going to get set for a hearing, and they'll have a public defender, or they'll get a private defense attorney to deal with this situation where not only did he have a weapon on him, but he evaded police and he assaulted a police officer. So that would be the immediate reaction of law enforcement if they didn't slow down and look deeper. And so when we're working with kids, we really want to make sure that we're advocating for people to look deeper. And this is what we found out about Miles. He's actually a 17-year-old Black male. He's raised by his grandmother. He's in the 10th grade at 17, hint, hint. And he's had 20 past school transfers. So as far back as the advocate can go is 20 different school transfers in his educational career. He does have an IEP for emotional disturbance and for ADHD, but he cannot read. He's bullied at school. He's called slow, some other expletive terms, and he was expelled a year ago for similar behavior. So now he's at an alternative school, and he's getting minimal services at that alternative school because they don't have a robust special education program. He continues to get in fights, and he's threatened by his peers at school all the time. So when you see this, again, things that probably jump out to you, go ahead and throw them in the chat. I noticed right away, he's raised by his grandmother. So where are his parents? Do his biological parents still have their parental rights, or does grandma have the rights? Is it a community raising him, or were his parental rights terminated at some point by a court? Because that's traumatic in and of itself. What other things are noticed?
So I'm not going to miss my chance this time. So the fact that I see a conflict on this list, right? He has an IEP for specific disorders. He can't read in the 10th grade. And at the same time, in one of the last bullet points, he's getting minimal services. So that seems like a natural conflict right there. Those things are in opposition.
That's perfect. Yes. So we see multiple school transfers. It's important to note that he's got an IEP, someone at some point classified him as something, but never focused on one of the biggest indicators of academic success, being able to read and write. And then, as Michael pointed out, he needs those services. The fact that he's getting minimal services now is really, exacerbating some of his issues and concerns. So that's awesome, but what are we supposed to do about it? And so some of the things that we might want to do are call on educational advocates to intervene. But if you don't have that resource in front of you, there are other things that you can do or provide in order to help these youth ensure that their services match what they are eligible for through the IDEA. So how can we work together as a group of people today coming together to talk about these individuals with disabilities? How can we work together to make sure that Miles is receiving the educational services that he needs to have a positive school experience? What are some things that we can do? I can go back to the list of things. What are some ideas?
So Regina, I'm going to read out of the chat. Alicia put into the chat. that he might need a better behavior plan, since there's already some specific classifications for special education.
Okay.
So an advocate might take on that and ask for something pretty specific.
Ooh, Tabitha, talking about self-advocacy. Yes, yes, yes. Tabitha mentioned to educate him to make sure he has a right to an IEP. One of the things that we were able to do through our work with the New Jersey Council on Developmental Disabilities was that they offered us a grant to provide self-advocacy resources to individuals who are in this exact same situation. So we'll provide you with some of those resources, but it includes understanding your rights when you have an IEP if you go through a disciplinary proceeding. It includes understanding your rights to what should be in an IEP. And more specifically, it includes all of our work that we've been doing to establish a formal, ideal transition plan that can be included in the IEP and also be given to court stakeholders so that the future is a holistic community approach rather than just dealing with the one issue or the one crisis that's happening at that time. So our transition planning app will be available shortly for all people to utilize on the Disability Rights New Jersey website. And it is an app that takes students through 22 questions that are tailored to meet the needs of what a transition plan would have here in the state of New Jersey. Kentucky has one and Texas also offers one, and so does Alabama. Those are the other 3 states that have them as well. But you can go onto the website and see what types of questions are being asked to maybe create your own if you're not in the state of New Jersey. And we also see people holding the high school accountable, using making sure that that individual, Miles, has the emotional support to get through whatever proceedings or situation he's involved in. And most importantly, making sure that they're enrolled and back in the school system with the appropriate services and supports. That's so very important. Barb had mentioned that it's important for young people to really understand their rights and their role in self-advocacy so that they can have their own voices heard. And I think that that's really important. You know, Barb, a lot of these youth are always being told what to do. And it's important that we recognize that they have a voice as well. So when we're working with youth at Disability Rights New Jersey, we have identified that the common places for educational advocacy are in assessments and evaluations, re-enrollment issues, making sure that the review of the individualized education plan or behavior intervention plan is appropriate, ensuring that the school that they're placed in, just like our case study of Miles, you know, is really making sure that he is at a school that will best meet his needs, and that they'll be able to provide the services that are required through IDEA, the Individuals Disabilities Education Act, so that Miles can receive the best education possible. And to obviously ensure that proper services and supports are in place. You know, Teresa just mentioned he might be afraid to speak up for himself. Distrust in the school system and the inability or lack of desire to feel like you have a space at the table is really, really common with a lot of youth with juvenile justice involvement. And so it's important that when we're working with these youth and their families, we identify and acknowledge that in the past, they might not have felt that their voice had a space at the table, but it's important to prepare them so that they feel confident enough to share their wants, needs, strengths, preferences, and more importantly, where they feel that they have weaknesses and need some intervention. And so we have, through our programs at Education Law Center with Ruby and Disability Rights New Jersey, with myself and our juvenile justice team, we have been able to provide educational advocacy for youth and technical assistance to stakeholders or community members who have questions when they're working with this population. And with that, wonderful conversation. We are out of time, but are there any questions that we can kind of head up in the next 2 or 3 minutes before you move on to your next session?
Regina, this is Barb. As I said, that we've been wanting to get the younger generation to get involved in self-advocacy. so they could learn how to be good role models and leaders. And, you know, I'm not trying to be smart because, you know, we're getting old now. So I think it's time for them to learn, you know, and get involved so they can know how to get their voices heard out there.
Amen. Barb, it's time to pass the baton to some
That's
younger
right.
folks.
So, hi, everybody. This is Gwen Orloski. I'm the executive director here at Disability Rights New Jersey. And Barb, I have to also affirm what you just said, right? Like, I'm in your range, right? It's time to think about the future generation. I do want to just give just a huge thank you to both Ruby and Regina. I thought this was magnificent. I learned so much and so critically important, and a conversation that hasn't really gone on robustly, I think, here in New Jersey. And I think we are on our way. So I wanted to thank you very much. And I also want to give a shout out to the New Jersey Council on Developmental Disabilities, because without their support, this whole series of webinars and this conference would just not have taken the shape that it did. So huge thanks to them also.
And Laura asked a question about roles that specialists can play if they are working with youth who have a disability or they assessed a disability, and then their own kids on their caseload get involved with the police. And, you know, one of the things that happens in New Jersey is that community providers, like service providers, get to write a court letter. They can also write that letter to the police, to the station house where the incident was being filed and reported. And so I would encourage anyone who is working with a youth who has information that they would like to provide, you reach out to the family and you ask for consent to be able to send a letter or information on the behalf of the youth with a disability. Always ask for that consent first. Make sure that you have the consent to send information. You might want to share it with the youth or the family as well. And then I would recommend drafting a letter, putting it in writing so that that can follow the case as it moves along. It's really important to have that support from a child study team. And I recognize very much what you're saying. There are times where we will involve a school district and the child study team case manager, the social worker, psychologist, they'll be like, what happened? Oh no, right? And they have a very different viewpoint and take on what they can do to help mitigate the situation. And then also it is, while we're talking about community partners and all of these great organizations that are working together to address this population, the ARC of New Jersey focuses on a criminal justice aspect as a whole, not 100% specifically on juveniles, but justice with the population for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And those webinars are incredible. So if you're looking for more resources, that's another great place to look as well.
Okay. On that note, we have to say adieu. So thank you so much, Regina and Ruby, and everyone else that contributed and participated. And I hope everyone will attend the keynote in a little bit. So thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
You guys, bye.